Something is deeply wrong with what we're being told, and the silence coming out of Tel Aviv right now is louder than anything the mainstream press has printed in weeks. Netanyahu has not made a verified public appearance in days. No live press conference, no unscripted footage, no credible, time-stamped confirmation of his whereabouts. And in the middle of an active war, that absence is not procedural. That is significant. Hezbollah and Hamas have both issued statements claiming a major operational victory, and while Western outlets are bearing the lead, the intelligence community in Washington is not sleeping. These are not random claims from fringe actors. These are organized resistance movements with real battlefield infrastructure, satellite communications, and decades of asymmetric warfare experience. When they speak with this level of coordinated confidence, history has repeatedly shown us that something real is underneath it. The geopolitical architecture of the entire Middle East could be shifting in real time right now while you are watching this. Let me start with what we actually know, because in a situation like this, the facts themselves are more disturbing than any theory you could build around them. Benjamin Netanyahu, the sitting Prime Minister of Israel, a country that is actively engaged in military operations on multiple fronts simultaneously, has gone conspicuously quiet. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, not as a sensational claim, but as a geopolitical reality that demands serious scrutiny. Leaders at war do not disappear from public view without consequence. Every hour of silence from a wartime head of government is a political signal, whether intentional or not. And the signals coming out of this particular silence are extraordinarily loud. Now, let us talk about what Hezbollah and Hamas have actually said, because this is where the Western press has done a profound disservice to its audience. Both organizations issued coordinated statements claiming a significant operational victory. The language used was not vague. It was not the usual battlefield bravado that resistance movements sometimes deploy to maintain morale. The specificity of the claims, the timing of the claims, and the coordination between two separate organizations that operate in different theaters of war, Lebanon and Gaza, tells us something important. When two adversaries synchronize a narrative of victory at the same moment, in the same window of time, that is not a coincidence. That is a communication strategy, and communication strategies of this kind are deployed when there is something real to communicate. And this is where I want you to think carefully about the architecture of modern information warfare, because we are all swimming in it right now. The Western media's response to these claims was not investigative, it was not analytical, it was dismissive, almost reflexively so, in a way that should itself raise questions, because when the press corps of the most powerful country in the world decides that a claim from a major regional military organization is not worth serious examination, you have to ask why. Not rhetorically, you genuinely have to ask why. What institutional pressure produces that kind of editorial uniformity? What does it mean when every major outlet lands on the same dismissive framing within hours of each other? That is not journalism, that is coordination. Let me take you back a little, because context matters enormously here. Netanyahu has been under extraordinary pressure for years now. The judicial reform crisis tore Israeli society apart at the seams. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets in one of the most sustained protest movements in the country's history. The military itself, which in Israel is not a distant institution but is woven into the fabric of everyday civilian life, saw reserve soldiers publicly threatened to refuse service. That is not a small thing. That is a civilization-level rupture in social cohesion. And then October 7th happened and everything changed. And Netanyahu used that catastrophe, and it was a catastrophe, to reconsolidate his political position. The man who was politically terminal in the summer of 2023 found himself back at the center of the national narrative by the fall. That is a remarkable political resurrection, and it was built on blood and fire. But here is what gets overlooked in the Western framing. The war in Gaza has not gone according to plan, not by any honest military assessment. Israel has brought devastating force to bear on one of the most densely populated territories on earth, and Hamas has not been destroyed. Hezbollah has not been neutralized. The Abraham Accords framework, which was supposed to reshape the regional order and isolate the resistance movements permanently, is under profound stress. Saudi Arabia has not normalized. The Arab Street, which Western analysts have been confidently declaring irrelevant for decades, has turned with a fury that is reshaping domestic politics across the region. And meanwhile, Hezbollah in the north has demonstrated a military capability that, frankly, caught a lot of people by surprise. Their precision missile inventory, their drone capabilities, their ability to sustain operations over extended periods, these are not the characteristics of a militia. These are the characteristics of a serious military force. So when Hezbollah says it has achieved something significant, you need to understand what kind of organization is making that claim. This is not a ragged insurgency operating out of caves. This is an organization that has spent 20 years building military infrastructure with Iranian support, Russian tactical input, and real battlefield experience from Syria. They watched how the United States fought wars, they studied Israeli doctrine, they adapted. And the men who lead Hezbollah are not impulsive. They are deliberate, patient, and strategically sophisticated in a way that their Western caricatures simply do not capture. Now let us talk about the information blackout more specifically. In the age of social media, in the age of smartphones, in an era when every world leader is photographed and filmed and tracked with an obsessive granularity that previous generations could not have imagined, a verifiable absence is extraordinarily difficult to manufacture or maintain. Think about what it takes to keep a sitting head of government genuinely off the grid even for a short period. You need cooperation from your own security apparatus. You need coordination across multiple government ministries. You need the press corps to either not notice, not care, or be actively managed. Any one of those conditions is manageable. All three simultaneously for an extended period in the middle of a war. That is a much more complex operation. And the question you have to ask is why that operation would be necessary. There are several possibilities here, and I'm going to walk through them honestly, because honest analysis means holding multiple hypotheses at once rather than collapsing immediately to the most dramatic or the most comfortable conclusion. The first possibility is that Netanyahu is fine, that he is managing a security situation that genuinely requires temporary operational silence, and that in due course he will reappear and the absence will be explained in bureaucratic terms. That is possible. Governments do sometimes pull leaders from public view during genuine security emergencies, and the Middle East is nothing if not a genuine security emergency at almost any given moment. The second possibility is that he has suffered some kind of medical event. Netanyahu is not a young man. He is operating under conditions of extreme stress in a wartime environment with a domestic political situation that would tax anyone's constitution. Medical crises happen to powerful men. They have happened throughout history, and when they happen, governments lie about it, consistently and predictably, because the appearance of a leader's physical vulnerability is itself a strategic liability. So a medical explanation is not only possible, it is historically well precedented, and the institutional incentives to conceal it are extremely strong. The third possibility, and this is the one that Hezbollah and Hamas are pointing toward, the one that the Western press is refusing to examine, is that something happened operationally, that the resistance movements, who have both demonstrated genuine intelligence penetration of Israeli military and civilian infrastructure, managed to locate and target Netanyahu specifically. This is not an outlandish claim in the context of what we know about the operational capabilities of these organizations. Israel itself has used targeted assassination as a primary tool of statecraft for decades. The moral and strategic logic of targeted assassination is not alien to this conflict. It is foundational to this conflict. So the idea that a sophisticated adversary, one with the resources, the patience, and the demonstrated capability of Hezbollah, might attempt the same thing in reverse, that is not fantasy. That is strategic symmetry. And here is where I want to talk about what this means at the level of geopolitics, because the identity and the condition of Netanyahu specifically is not just a human interest story. It is a load-bearing pillar of a very particular regional order. Netanyahu has been the central figure in Israeli politics for the better part of 3 decades. His political identity, his personal legacy, his entire conception of himself is built around the idea of Israel's security and his role as its indispensable guardian. He is not just a prime minister, he is an ideology, and ideologies that are embodied in a single person are extraordinarily fragile, because the moment that person is removed from the equation, the ideology has to find a new vessel, and in the chaos of that transition, things can shift very quickly. Think about what a genuine leadership vacuum in Israel would mean right now. You have active military operations in Gaza, you have a northern front with Hezbollah that is operating at a level of intensity not seen since 2006, You have ongoing operations in the West Bank. You have diplomatic pressure from the International Criminal Court, from the International Court of Justice, from a growing number of European governments that have moved toward recognition of Palestinian statehood. You have a domestic coalition government that is, by every honest description, a coalition of contradictions held together largely by the political gravity of one man. Remove that man and the coalition does not hold. And when the coalition does not hold, you do not just get a political crisis. You get a strategic crisis because the military is waiting for civilian direction, and if civilian direction becomes incoherent or absent, you have a genuinely dangerous situation in one of the most heavily armed and strategically sensitive territories on the planet. Now let us think about the American dimension of this, because nothing in the Middle East exists outside of the American dimension. The United States has invested more political capital, more military hardware, more diplomatic protection in Israel than in any other relationship in its entire foreign policy history. The Biden administration, and now the current administration, has been managing this conflict with an eye on domestic political consequences as much as on strategic outcomes. The Israeli lobby in Washington is not a secret. It is one of the most powerful and well-organized political forces in American civic life. And the relationship between Netanyahu personally and American political figures, particularly on the Republican side, has been unusually intimate and unusually public. So, a genuine question about Netanyahu's condition is also, inescapably, a question about American policy. Because if the man who has been the central interlocutor for that policy relationship is gone or incapacitated, then the entire framework of US-Israel relations in this moment enters a period of uncertainty. And uncertainty is something that Washington manages very badly. I also want to talk about the broader resistance axis because I think Western audiences genuinely do not understand what has been built over the last 2 decades. Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, various militia forces in Iraq and Syria, these are not separate, disconnected entities. They are components of a coherent, if sometimes fractious, strategic architecture. They share intelligence, they coordinate timing, they operate with a common strategic objective that is not simply the destruction of Israel, as it is so often framed in Western media, but the fundamental reorganization of the regional power structure and the removal of American military hegemony from the Middle East. That is a political goal. It is a sophisticated political goal. And in the last 2 years, that axis has demonstrated a capacity for sustained, coordinated action that has surprised even its sympathizers. The Houthis effectively shut down commercial traffic through the Red Sea, one of the most important maritime corridors in the global economy, and held that position for months. Hezbollah has fired more rockets and missiles into northern Israel than at any point since 2006, displacing over 100,000 Israeli civilians and making large parts of the Galilee uninhabitable. Hamas, despite losing enormous numbers of fighters and civilian infrastructure, has not collapsed as an organization. The resistance is not winning in the conventional military sense, but it is not losing in the strategic sense. And in asymmetric warfare, not losing is winning. So when you put all of that together, the absence of Netanyahu, the coordinated claims of victory from Hezbollah and Hamas, the media blackout in the West, the extraordinary stress fractures in Israeli society, and the demonstrated strategic sophistication of the resistance axis, what you are looking at is a moment of genuine historical significance. I am not going to tell you exactly what happened because I do not know exactly what happened, and anyone who tells you they do is either lying or speculating. But I will tell you this, the shape of this moment, the texture of it, the way the information is moving, and the way the silence is being maintained, this does not look like a normal episode of geopolitical noise. This looks like something that people in positions of power on multiple sides of this conflict know is significant and are managing very carefully. The question for us, and by us I mean people who are trying to understand the world as it actually is, not as the mainstream narrative would like us to believe it is, the question is what comes next, because whether Netanyahu reappears tomorrow, whether it turns out he had a medical episode, whether the claims from the resistance movements are eventually substantiated or are eventually shown to be an exaggeration, the underlying dynamics that produced this moment do not change. Israel is in the middle of a war it has not been able to win quickly. The resistance is proving more durable than anyone in Tel Aviv or Washington planned for. The global moral consensus is shifting, slowly but unmistakably, away from unconditional support for Israeli military operations. And the American public, which for decades has absorbed a very particular framing of this conflict, is showing signs, especially among younger generations, of arriving at genuinely different conclusions. History is not made in clean, dramatic moments that are immediately recognizable. It is made in these murky, uncertain intervals where the old order is visibly straining and the new order has not yet declared itself. We may be in one of those intervals right now. And the people who come out of it with a clearer understanding of what actually happened will be the ones who resisted the comfort of the official narrative long enough to ask the harder questions. That is what this moment demands. Not panic, not certainty, but rigorous, honest, clear-eyed attention to what is actually happening and the willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere that powerful institutions would prefer you did not go.